by the end of high school, they're in terrible shape. And as a consequence of that, we are not putting the proper number of people into the education cycle to get them up to skill levels, which creates much less, or would create a good deal less, in the way of income inequality. And I also argue in the book that we ought to be opening up our borders to skilled labor from all parts of the world, because if we were to do that, we would increase the supply of skilled workers, which our schools have been unable to create, and as a consequence of that, we would lower the average wage of skills and reduce the degree of income inequality in this country. It's a very important issue, and it's a very important issue which I raise in my book, and we have to confront this both at the education level and on the immigration level. And it's not anything to do with what I am proposing. And just remember that the type of globalized economy that I support has taken hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's created a standard of living throughout the world which is unprecedented in history. And to assume that that is something we should be apologizing for, I find is wholly inappropriate.
NAOMI KLEIN.
Well, you mentioned Latin America, and of course there is a rise in left-wing political parties and movements in Latin America, but this is after decades of adherence to IMF structural adjustment policies, and it's precisely because those policies failed to lift people out of poverty in countries like Bolivia that you have this rise of what you're calling economic populism. It's because trickle-down economics was seen to have failed. But you also mentioned economic populism in Latin America in your book, and you blame it for for inflation episodes and the collapse of regimes and the toppling of governments. And one of your examples was Chile in the 1970s. Was Salvador Allende's regime toppled because of inflation, or didn't the CIA have something to do with that?
Well, look, I'm using Latin America as an example. The key question is not Latin America. Let's get back to the United States. Let's get back to the world at large and face the issue of populism here. Remember, the populist issue in Latin America goes back to the roots of Spanish and Portuguese colonization.
I'm aware of that, Mr. Greenspan, but there were many developmentalist policies that were trying to address those colonial disparities. They called it import substitutions, and those leaders were systematically eliminated in a series of coups.
Well, let me ask you a question, which you are just taking the capitalist system, to state it very bluntly, and say it's deficient here, it's deficient there, it's deficient every other place. The capitalist system has created more economic wealth in the last 7 or 8 years around the world. And as I said before, it's had huge effects in the developing world. Hundreds of millions of people have come out of poverty. And as a consequence of this, not on the basis of populist policies, but on the basis of policies which relate to markets, it strikes me that, you can say all of the problems that exist in market economies, and in my book you will find I am very much aware of all of them in great detail. The question you have to answer, however, is what system works better? And I think the evidence going back to the Enlightenment of the early part of the 18th century and all of the events that occurred with respect to what's happened to the world since then has demonstrated that this system is the only one that seems to work well. I mean, all forms of socialist structure, which you seem to be implicitly in favor of, have failed.
Actually, I'm referring to mixed economies.
I'm not. Issue here?
Actually, I'm referring to mixed economies here. I'm not referring to state socialism.
Well, the question is, when you begin to talk in terms of changing what you're implicitly saying, and I've heard this story before, you have to say, what are you changing in favor of? And we've had regrettable problems throughout the world. Every time we've moved in the direction you're implying, the poverty level has gone up, not down.
Well, Mr. Greenspan, I think it's worth remembering that the word populist simply means popular. So obviously a lot of people disagree with your assessment of the benefits
of... A lot of people disagree with my assessment. A lot of people disagree with
and are interested in another economic model.
Democracy work.
There was something that I was quite interested in your book, which was your definition of corruption and crony capitalism. You said, when a government's leaders or businesses routinely seek out private sector individuals or businesses and, in exchange for political support, bestow favors on them, the society is said to be in the grip of crony capitalism. You say the favors generally take the form of monopoly access to certain markets, preferred access to sales of government assets, and special access to those in power. I kept thinking about Halliburton, Blackwater, Lockheed, and Boeing. You were referring to Indonesia at the time, but I'm wondering, according to your definition, and we're seeing these we're seeing contracting emerging, as in the words of the New York Times, a fourth arm of government. Front page of the New York Times talks about $6 billion being investigated for criminal activity in contract allocation in Iraq. I'm wondering whether you think the United States is a crony capitalist economy, according to your definition.
Every economy exists, no matter what the level of democracy, has elements of crony capitalism. It's given human nature and given the democratic structures which we all, I assume, adhere to. That is an inevitable consequence. The major issue is it the dominant force within an economy? It was the dominant force under Suharto. It is not the dominant force in this country.
Well, how about this? In 2003, when you were head of the Federal Reserve, the U.S. government handed out 3,500 contracts to companies to perform security functions. In 2006, the year that you left the Federal Reserve, they handed out 115,000 such contracts. It seems to me that it is becoming a dominant force.
Are you talking about the contracts that the Federal Reserve put out?
I'm talking about the crony capitalist system of a Republican government handing out an extraordinary level of contracts to private companies who then support these politicians with the political favors that you're describing in your book and your definition of crony capitalism. You've overseen an explosion of the contract economy.
Final word, Alan Greenspan.
I understand what you're saying. Are you saying the Federal Reserve is doing that, or the government is doing it?
I'm saying that the U.S. government is doing it.
Well, the U.S. government has to purchase equipment from the private sector. It doesn't produce it itself, and you may characterize it in many different ways, and obviously I'm not going to deny that there's all sorts of corruption that goes on in every country. The problem, essentially, for a democratic society is to maintain the civil liberties of the society and suppress that. Corruption, embezzlement, fraud, these are all characteristics which exist everywhere. It is regrettably the way human nature functions, whether we like it or not. What successful economies do is keep it to a minimum. No one has ever eliminated any of that stuff.
Well, on that note, we'll have to wrap up this discussion because I know you, Alan Greenspan, have to go, but I hope this is just part one of this discussion. Alan Greenspan's new book is called The Age of Turbulence, Adventures in a New World. NAOMI KLEIN, award-winning investigative journalist, is author of The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. I want to thank you both for being with us today.